the League of Women Voters of Butte County's panel on the role of journalism in preserving democracy. As I've already said, this meeting is being recorded and we will post it on our website and our Facebook page at a later time. Just by way of a brief intro, in an article from Stanford University, Stanford communication faculty member James Hamilton stated that journalism is said to be the first rough draft of history and that the media have been intertwined with and integral to democracy since the founding. Another Stanford communication faculty member, John Krosnick, in the same article said that democracy cannot function without communication, which allows voters to make informed choices among candidates. The news media, by which we mean both national and local sources and print/online, audio and visual, has regularly taken an active role in the workings of our democracy. But in most recent years, the relationship of the news media with both government officials and voters has become complicated, to say the least, exacerbated by social media and the influx of misinformation. Now we will discuss these issues and how the influence of the media and its relationship to elections and democracy could look going forward. With me are four panelists. I know in the meeting format, we have a lot of boxes here, and so you'll be able to see them pop up as they answer questions. But as I introduce them, if they could give a little wave, and so you could see who they all are, depending on the view you've got your Zoom screen in. So we have Dr. Jennifer Brundidge, Associate Professor in Communication Arts and Sciences at California State University, Chico. We have Natalie Hanson, reporter from the Chico Enterprise Record. We have Forrest Hartman, lecturer in journalism and public relations, California State University, Chico. And we have Mike Wolcott, editor, Chico Enterprise Record. And we have some more detailed biographies of our panelists posted on our website and Facebook. And they hopefully you've been given a chance to read them. I will just say that we've selected all four of them for their experience in the area. Dr. Brundidge has taught at Chico State since 2014. Her research and teaching focuses on advances in communication technology and how they impact the goals of diversity and equality associated with deliberative and participative models of democracy. Ms. Hanson has had a number of writing credits. Has experience at 5 student publications. She covers the city of Chico, seniors and general assignments. She's written for the Orion and A&E. She's studying journalism and international relations at Chico State. Whoops. Dr. Hartman has taught at Chico State since 2013 and has more than 15 years experience working at daily newspapers. He's interviewed a lot of big names in entertainment and has had bylines appear in some of the nation's largest newspapers. Mike Wolcott has been an editor of the ER since January 2019. He has worked at newspapers as small as the Corning Observer and as large as the San Francisco Chronicle. So that's a paraphrase of their bios, and you can read the full ones on our website. All right, so just by way of how this is gonna go, we'll first ask our panelists some questions prepared in advance by the League, then we'll take audience questions. For our audience, please submit your questions in the chat box. My co-moderator, Deborah Barger, who is the one with one of the many LWV virtual backgrounds, but she has her name on there. So she will be filtering the questions, not in the way we filter them in our forums, but just for duplication and things like that. And she will be handing them to me. If you private chat me the question, there's a good chance I will not see it. So please either just put it in the chat box to everyone if you're not used to chatting specific people, or just chat her privately. Questions can be directed at individual panelists. This is not a League forum. You may actually direct a question to somebody. But please like our forums, keep your questions civil. Also, I will not be enforcing question answer time limits like our forums. What a change, what a surprise. But we'll be generally keeping an eye on time to make sure we have time for audience questions and that people have an equal chance to be heard. All right. So the questions prepared by the League are going to be addressed to all our panelists, and I will just pick someone to answer first at random. So first question to get us started, overarching, what is the role of media, meaning print, audio, and visual, in preserving democracy. And I'm going to go ahead and start with Ms. Hanson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to start by saying that I believe the role of the media is first and foremost, it's preserving accountability, it's preserving transparency of our authorities, but it's also a very important part of preserving democracy in that it's a window into multiple perspectives within in our country, in our local systems. So for example, a local newspaper is able to not only hold authority figures accountable, but bring forward more voices that don't get represented, don't get windows into their viewpoint per se. So without that pillar of accountability and transparency, really, we don't have a window into democracy.
Thank you. Let's go next to Forrest Hartman. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Well, I'm afraid you'll get a lot of very similar answers on this one, looking at the panelists. But I think journalism's role in democracy is absolutely critical for the reasons that Natalie said, and without an independent monitor of power, there's really no way to keep power in check. And I think it's particularly important in the modern communication environment when we have people in positions of power, not necessarily just politicians, but CEOs, people in powerful positions all around the country that also have extremely good communication tools at their disposal. So in many ways, modern politicians, CEOs, et cetera, have the ability to reach the citizenry in the same way that major media outlets do. But of course, if you're a power figure, the messaging that you're going to send out is going to very directly promote whatever it is you're trying to promote. Having the press as an independent monitor of your power, hopefully keeps things in check and makes sure that those in power are acting in the best interests of society and not only in their own best interests.
Thank you. Let's go to Jennifer Brundidge next.
Thank you, Claire. So I have a rather long answer to this question.
It's not a candidate forum, so I'm not timing you. Isn't that wonderful?
Okay. This is a big one for me, right? And actually, I think my answer is a little bit different than the rest of the panelists, though I agree with their answers as well. To me, the most important thing that the press can do for democracy is to inform the public, right? To inform the electorate. In fact, an informed electorate is the thing that makes democracy, in spite of all of its skeptics, right? Way back, thinking back to Machiavelli and, all of the political philosophers that were quite skeptical of the public and their capacity to self-govern. An informed public is what makes that possible. So Claire, I think you're right to go back to our founding and talk about how communication and the press were really essential to making any approximation to democracy work, right? Without the newspaper and, ultimately the penny press, nothing like a majoritarian democracy could emerge in the US. How do you have such a large nation, right, with no basis for voting, right? Even if we're going way back, right? Even if it's only white males voting, right? Even they, right, don't have a basis for voting without a press. If we look back to the 1830s when, Alexander de Tocqueville was, the French aristocrat, was observing American democracy and sort of wondering what makes American democracy work. He said that it was newspapers in part, right, that formed a basis for at least a moderately informed electorate who could then associate with one another and organize with one another. And so over time, the problem has shifted less from, gosh, do we have an informational basis for democracy, to maybe we have too much information, and we have too much complexity and too much choice, really, in the contemporary media environment. And so now, with the internet and social media, we have so much choice, and that you would think would lead to an informed electorate, right? We have so much choice, so much information, and yet what we do with that choice isn't always in the best interest of democracy. Many of us with so much choice opt out of news altogether, right? We have so much choice in entertainment that we don't have to watch the news or read the news. Others of us, right, who are hyper interested in the news and hyper partisan, go online and selectively expose ourselves to like-minded perspectives and kind of carefully maybe avoid non-like-minded perspectives. And so with that, right, we see economic models and news models, right, that are built on polarizing the public, that sometimes contribute to misinformation or even disinformation. And so the news still, right, the most powerful thing that it could do today is to inform the electorate, and responsible news organizations should act as a corrective to all of the misinformation that gets propagated and spread throughout this complex media landscape. And yet I know it's such a challenge, right? It's such a challenge, and how do they do this? And that's the big question, right, for me.
Well, and I think we'll get deeper into that as we go on. Mike Wolcott. You're muted, Mike. There you go.
How's that? Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for having me on, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for putting this together, and I think doing a really nice job of picking a panel here with a bunch of different views from some different angles. And it's rewarding to me to look at some of the names on here and recognize so many Enterprise Record readers, just that I know from their names, from having spoken with them, or we got several letter to the editor writers on here. And every chance I get now, I thank people who still read their daily newspaper. I think this industry took that for granted for far too long. I promise to never do it again. And seriously, everybody that reads our paper, thank you. It's noticed and appreciated, especially from this corner office here. On this topic, there's always a couple of kind of fallbacks I go to, and Claire used one right off the bat, which is that we write the first draft of history, and that's a very solemn and important role that we fill, and that I think we're aware of every day. And we keep the times we're in right now, I think we're pretty aware we're in some pretty amazing times in what we're doing and how we go about it. And if there's two things my staff hears me hopefully say over and over, is get it right and be fair. Because as Jennifer has mentioned, and as I think we're probably going to talk about a lot tonight, it's never been easier to find a news source that tells you exactly what you want to hear every day. And you'll never hear anything else given that choice. And it's our job. I mean, it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge, as Jennifer mentioned, but it's also a great opportunity for those of us who, consider ourselves to be professional journalists, and it's what we do because we love it, to lift that, to, hopefully show people that, hey, over time, you're going to get different sides. You're not always going to like the sides that you hear, but we're going to report them all, and we're going to be fair about it. And my first byline in a newspaper was in June 1976, and that was shortly after Watergate. And journalists were among the most respected profession in the country then, for all kinds of reasons. Our ratings probably, I think we're down closer to Congress these days probably than the top. But again, it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity to get things right and be fair about it. And the other fallback thing I always kind of like to go to is the Jefferson quote. Basically, given a choice between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. And we've seen far too many examples, I think the past few years in particular, of governments that just wish the media would go away or only tell their side of the story. And man, I mean, talk about a time where it's vital for all of us to do our jobs and not fall into that trap. It's today. And that's why we do what we do.
Thank you. Well, our next question is building on things that have been touched on already. So this is certainly not the first time that in history that the media has been criticized by elected officials. For example, past presidents have criticized the press plenty, but there was no Twitter or Facebook back then. It was duked out in the written word and back and forth. But if you could describe the unique challenges of reporting the news in the face of criticism and accusations of bias in our present day, and I'm going to start with Forrest Hartman.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I did hit on this a little bit already in answer to the first question. And interestingly, you said something about the relationship between journalists and citizens and politicians being complicated today. I would assert that that has really always been the case. I mean, if you look back historically, I don't think you will ever find a time when everybody loved the press. And I've had that discussion many times. People keep telling me, well, if we could just go back to, and I'm like, well, which era do you want to go back to? Because I'm sure I can give you examples of divisive rhetoric and attacks on journalists in whatever era you pick. But I think when you bring up social media, you do bring up perhaps the most complicated of all the things that we're facing today. In that you have a handful of big tech companies out there with an extraordinary amount of control over the information that is disseminated. And not only do you have that, but you have these tech companies with a profit motive that in some cases actually encourages the dissemination of misinformation. So if you are a good journalist, which I think everybody here in this discussion is, you have to convince people that you're not like X outlet. You have to set yourself apart from all of the misinformation. And again, it's pretty well documented that a lot of these companies, that the Facebooks and the Twitter of the world, have a financial stake in dragging people down into rabbit holes. There's a pretty good documentary out on Netflix which explores it called The Social Dilemma. The Atlantic has a really fine article that just came out that talks about this very problem. And I would argue that that is probably the biggest problem that journalists face today. I'll be curious to hear what Mike and Natalie have to say, because they're in newsrooms every day to this date. But I think setting yourself apart from all the outlets that are really doing the opposite of what you are doing, which is providing good, accurate information, is quite a challenge today.
Well, then let's hear from Natalie on that question.
Yes, thank you. Clara, you touched on, and Forrest touched on it as well, the difference in how the media engages with the public nowadays is so different. And I think in order to be able to answer your question, we first have to acknowledge that most people today live in an echo chamber on social media to one extent or another, no matter how little or how much they're on the internet. Therefore, you are warring with them for their attention, and you're warring with them for trust in the facts that your news outlet is putting out. So one of the most important things is to know your beat, to know the community you serve very well. As a reporter, something I never, as a high school student here in Chico, did not anticipate was that part of my entire life would need to be on social media so that I could understand many of the different conversations going on and understand why, when presented with so many choices, as I know Ms. Brundidge also mentioned, people would rather turn to a safe echo chamber on social media that really echoes back what they want to hear, rather than perhaps considering multiple perspectives. So understanding that we live in an incredibly polarized society, understanding the misinformation that comes from that, it's important that we also put aside there's one side and then there's this side. We have to put that away and know that there are many sides to many issues. There are many actors with many different agendas. And once we understand that and really know our beat, we are able to report the truth. And when it comes back to it, it's all about reporting the truth and knowing the multiple perspectives at play. And I think when you do that, you do establish integrity with your community, as well as by establishing really strong connections and having trust with the people that you know. They know you've talked to them, you've gotten to know them, you've been down on the street with them, hopefully, even with COVID. But also then they know that you are aware of the environment they are also in, and you've seen the social media, but you are rising above it with the facts and the truth. And that's really all you can do. If they do retreat to the isolation chamber, they're going to do that. But you know you have integrity and you're reporting the truth.
Great. Let's hear from Mike next. Unmute Mike. Unmute Mike. Mike, unmute.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You talk about new technology, and now that I'm over to the mute button, I remember interviewing somebody here about 5 years ago for a job, and there always comes a point where you ask them, do you have any questions for me? His first question for me was, when you started in this business, did you use a typewriter instead of a computer? And I was a little taken aback by this shot at my age, I thought, and I said, yes, I did. And his follow-up was it electric? And I hired the guy anyway, but it was just a reminder that, wow, I've been doing this a long time, and it really is a different environment now. And the accusations of bias have been there for as long as I've been doing it. And for most of the first half of my career, I covered sports. And it was a lot like what we hear now. I mean, every day we'd hear from readers that, I worked in the Bay Area for 23 years, and half of our readers thought we loved the 49ers and hated the Raiders. The other half was convinced it was the other way around. And there was no convincing them that no, we cover both. And now every day I get two criticisms, that I'm too liberal and that I'm too conservative, and that our newspaper is. And trying to explain to people, I get a pretty like number of complaints from, I don't like to say both sides, but I'll say it, both sides. And they never believe that. They're convinced, oh no, it's just so obvious you're biased this way. And a lot of people I've worked for in this industry would tell us, well, if you're getting the complaints on an equal basis from both sides, that's probably a pretty good side. You're doing it just about right. And I don't know if I 100% agree with that, but it is, but we do. We catch it from both sides every day, more than ever. And you can go back to, to date myself again, Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon, and journalism being enemies of the government and all, but we never had a president that said for so many years that we were an enemy of the people. And that had a big trickle down effect to journalists working in places the size of be it the Bay Area or Chico or Eureka or any place even smaller, because people hear that, and in the era of the echo chamber, like Natalie mentioned, that word gets bandied about across, and it gets thrown at us too. And I don't think President Trump really had the Chico Enterprise record in mind when he started throwing out terms like enemy of the people. But we catch it on a local basis, and we catch it with the same ferocity and anger that CNN reporters might have been catching on town halls too. So yeah, it's a different time to be doing this. And I'll go back to something I say with the first answer, which was, in terms of social media, yeah, it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity. And we see things, we have a scanner in the newsroom, which we haven't actually worked in the newsroom for almost a year now. But in the old days, that's how you would find out there was a fire, or there was an accident, or there was a police episode going on somewhere. Now, as much as anything, we might find out about it from a local scanner group on Facebook or something like that. And I'm not directing this at any group, but the problem there is fairly often incorrect information will be filtering through the discussions and the forums that are going on there. And again, it's really easy for us to find something, and we'll see things on there that get reported in the news, hopefully not by us very often, but we will see things that are incorrect that get reported based on something that was seen on Facebook. And we can't do that. We have to use an old journalism saying, if your mother says she loves you, get a second source. Well, if you see something on Facebook, get a second, third, and fourth source and make sure it's right before it's printed. One bad local example, just not too many months back, there was a shooting over on a Walnut by the 7-Eleven over there. And everything I read on social media at night said 2 people had been killed. But I never heard it anywhere else or saw anybody else reporting it. And the chief of police was kind enough to return a text to us in the middle of a city council meeting that night saying, no, it's 1. And we went to press with 1 when everybody else was saying 2. And that's the extra step we need to take in this era to kind of separate ourselves from, you know, what can be gossip and what can be news. And again, a challenge, but an opportunity.
Thank you. And let's go to Jennifer now.
Thanks. I have a shorter answer to this question. In part because you all have answered it so wonderfully, and you all are journalists, and so probably have more to say about the challenges of being a journalist during this time. I want to say that perhaps it's of some comfort, and maybe others have alluded to this as well. I don't actually think it's a comfort, but maybe for journalists it could be of some comfort that their challenges are not unique in terms of people, a declining trust in institutions, right? My own institution, education, declining trust, right? Religious institutions, government institutions. Gosh, if the Brits had any trust left in the royals as an institution, that sure is probably done after Oprah's interview the other night. So we have declining trust in institutions, I think for a variety of reasons. Some of them, I think, probably quite warranted. Others, not. And then, you know, it's perhaps not a huge surprise then that we would elect kind of the ultimate anti-institutionalist, anti-establishment figure in Donald Trump, who would then use his platform to further criticize and undermine the institutions that he never respected, right, to begin with. So I guess my hope is for all of our institutions that, and for journalism in particular, that they will continue, you know, like Mike does, right, to stay above the fray and to, you know, not worry too much about what's happening on Twitter, and to remember, you know, their responsibility to the public, regardless of, you know, what Donald Trump or anyone else is saying.
Thank you. So this next question, Natalie Hanson actually got a bit into it when she talked about just being in the community. So I'd like to talk about local news. So of course, we all in Butte County, I feel like we have a lot of love for our local news for a lot of reasons. And for the unfortunate reason that we've had a lot of disasters in the past few years, and our local news, the radio, the ER, the Paradise Post, the Mercury Register, Action News Now, they've all been really great about informing the public, KRCR, you know, informing the public of what was happening on the ground, like what you needed to know. They were the news sources I personally stuck with when, like during the campfire, during the fires this last summer, what we needed to know and the right information, because they were there, boots on the ground, sometimes like flames behind them, looking very alarming to those of us watching, wondering about their safety. So we all really value local news. So I'd like to talk about why you all believe local news organizations, print, video, audio, visual, audio are so important. Of course, I've gotten into that already. And also specifically why you believe that local news can help combat misinformation in this age of information overload. So let's start with Natalie Hanson, since you kind of got started on that in your answer previously.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned the role of local media in disasters. Something that I think demonstrates what local news can do that sometimes larger outlets cannot is I've had it happen several times now where I went to the scene of something just after a disaster had happened, and some people naturally react when they know you're in the media and they say, don't talk to me, don't take photos of me, don't talk to me, I don't like the media. And I say, okay, I'm just here. And several times it's happened now where after a while, after talking to other people, watching me interact with them, they come up and I've had people apologize to me and say, I am so sorry. I have had such awful experiences with big media sources who basically helicopter in and helicopter out when something really horrible happens. We're the ones who stay behind and cover what continues to happen, because as we know, especially after the campfire, it doesn't just end. It never just ends. It's always like month after month, like things keep happening. People are still cleaning up what happened to them, and you're the one who's still there listening and getting on the phone with them. So I think that's really crucial, in that local news organizations have that face and that connection that large outlets, unfortunately, a lot of mistrust has been coming to the media in general, that they don't understand. They're detached. They just want to report whatever whoever owns them wants to report, and that mistrust comes down to us. But we have the ability to really get to know our community and really establish integrity with them because we understand them. And I think that can help combat misinformation, because unfortunately one of our biggest challenges is, especially as we've seen in rural areas where papers, unfortunately lots of papers have disappeared. And in their place, you either have a news desert, or you unfortunately have astroturfing take place, and misinformation outlets can then arrive, and people simply do not know the difference. So it is our job, as we are still established in like smaller communities, that we have that integrity and we really do build those relationships of trust. And really keep ourselves established. And I think that's something local news already has an into, and major news outlets can try, but they often have to lean on us to really know a community. And that just tells you right there how important it is to a democracy, for people to really feel represented as well in their own local democracy.
All right, Mike, let's go to you next. Please unmute. I'll just start holding up a sign. Unmute, Mike, unmute.
I told myself I'm ready this time, so all right, 0 for 3. I was thinking back a few months ago before the election, and a lot of newspapers have stopped doing newspaper endorsements, and we discussed it here. And the argument that won out was, look, our readers don't have time to go to every city council meeting. They don't have time to go to all the forums. They don't have time to go to all the local meetings and, and talk to all of the local candidates here. Sure, they see the national and statewide candidates on TV or whatever every day, but locally they can't do that. And that really stuck with me, and was just a reminder that, that's what we do here, from a local standpoint. We're the eyes and ears of the community in terms of talking to, the newsmakers and the candidates. And an example of the importance of local news that just really sticks with me was, we brought up the campfire several times already tonight. In the aftermath of that, I mean, among everything else, we had a newspaper, the Paradise Post. It still exists only as a page or two in the Enterprise Record now. The campfire, eliminated a base for that newspaper. It took out the advertisers. It took out the people we delivered it to. It exists only on a masthead now. But for about 2 weeks after that, Rick Silva, who was and still is the editor of the Paradise Post, he started just driving up there and driving around every day. People started reaching out to him and saying, hey, Rick, my house is at such and such address. Would you mind driving by and seeing if it's still there? He said, sure, I'll do that. And then he got another request and another and another. And within 1 week, he had 1,500 new Facebook friend requests from people asking him if he would go by and see their house, every one of those people. And he didn't get to all 1,500, and it was only because his car broke down finally from driving around up there every day. But I look back at that and I think, I mean, I don't know what else local journalists have to do to show people that they care. And it was really a touching moment to me on the overpass right out here over East Park, right with all the signs where thank you firefighters, thank you firefighters. Somebody put up a sign that said, thank you, Rick Silva. That's the only sign I've seen up for a journalist in 45 years of doing this. So it made a big impression on me. But locally, there are ways you don't become a part of the story, but you give people a voice on the local level that they could never have otherwise. And Natalie mentioned the number of newspapers that are gone, and right around a third of the daily newspapers in the country are gone just in the last 20 years. And with that, more than half of the journalism jobs. The Enterprise Record 30 years ago had 43 people in our newsroom. Now we have 8. And guess what? We're trying to cover almost everything we did with 43, with a few exceptions. Fortunately, Forrest and Jennifer and the people at Chico State keep sending me journalists like Natalie who are able to do the work that 3 people used to do. And that's not an exaggeration. She's doing what 3 people used to do here. So, just to kind of wrap up my little spiel on it, another thing I say every day is you got to love this business to do it. I don't know why you'd want to do it otherwise. You got to love it to do it. And again, that's why when I see people who I know they read our paper, I thank them, because it means a lot. We need that to support to keep going.
Thank you. Let's go to Jennifer next.
Okay. Yeah, I think local news is probably more critically important now than ever before. And as far as news institutions go, I looked up the statistics today, and it seems that local news still is more trusted than national news, though that seems a bit precarious, but still, right? And I think it is because to a great extent still, local news, it remains nonpartisan. And I think that's, when we're talking about correcting misinformation or informing people about an important issue like the campfire or, COVID, right, locally, that is an incredibly important platform for doing so. And I was thinking about just why, right? Not only is it perceived as more credible, but I was also thinking about kind of people's cognitive mindset when they're reading local news versus reading national news. So with national news, I think we're very much in the mindset of reading it from a partisan lens, right? We put on our partisan hats when we watch our national, or we read our national news. And when we do that, we tend to engage in this thing called motivated reasoning, right? Where we process the information or the corrections on misinformation through a partisan lens that kind of allows us to arrive at a conclusion that is consistent with our kind of pre-existing beliefs and opinions. And so for some people, probably hyper-partisans, that partisanship is kind of chronically, accessible for them. So they're processing kind of all news that way, right? And I know that some of them are processing the ER that way, right? But, for others, and probably the majority of people, we're not always thinking about our partisanship, right? It might not even be that central to our identity. And so when we're reading local news and it doesn't get activated in a way, right? It doesn't kind of come to the forefront of how we see ourselves, then maybe we are less likely to engage in that kind of motivated reasoning and more open to facts and corrections of misinformation and, the science, right? And all that kind of stuff. Look, I'm even saying the science in quotes as if it's like, that somehow belongs there. But yeah, I think there's an incredible opportunity with local news in that regard.
Okay, let's go to Forrest now.
All right. Well, thanks. I got to say this is an incredibly tough question to answer after the previous 3 speakers, because I actually made a list of talking points that I would want to talk about in relation to this. And I think virtually all of them have been hit now. I mean, as far as the importance of local news, I would just ask people listening, imagine when the Oroville Dam crisis occurred, if there was no local news. Like what would you do? That's what I always say. People often attack journalists and say journalists are the enemy. But when we have a major crisis, what do? You turn into Action News Now, you read the Chico ER, you rely on those sources to tell you what's going on. So they're absolutely critical. And I think Natalie was absolutely right that, getting out into the public makes a difference, because people actually see local reporters and they see them as members of the community because they are members of the community. And I don't think you can overlook that. I had an opportunity to talk to Ron Howard last year about the Campfire documentary that he made, which was quite good. And one of the things I said was hey, Hollywood folks don't have the best reputation these days, just like journalists. People see them as outsiders living in an ivory tower. Were you seen as an outsider? Did you get people to talk to you, or was this difficult? And the thing he said related exactly back to what Natalie said. He said, well, not really, and I'll tell you why. Because we were there a lot. He's like, people got used to seeing us there, and told a story sort of similar to Natalie. Yeah, at first there were people that were uncomfortable that said, I don't know if I want to talk to you. I don't know if I want to be part of this. But when we kept coming back, they said, okay, you're really here to tell us our story. And I think that's where local news outlets are uniquely positioned. The other thing that I would love to see that I think is a dream because of things that Mike brought up there, the financial pressures that news organizations are facing today are insane. As Mike said, Natalie's doing the job of 3 reporters. I haven't worked day to day at a daily newspaper for a little over 10 years. And the newspaper that I last worked for was the biggest in Northern Nevada. I believe it's got about 25% of the reporting staff that was there when I got hired on. It's just a shell of what it was. But I would really love to see sort of the return of the ombudsman or the ombudswoman, which, not that they have all disappeared, but it's very rare to see them at a local level. And the reason I say that is one of the key things that I see in media is a misunderstanding of how media works. There's a lot of anger about bias, but all the time on social media, I see assertions made about how the media operates that are just untrue, right? And I can say, you know what? I worked in daily newspapers for nearly 20 years, and I never once saw what you just told me happens every day. When was the last time you were in a newsroom? And they've never been in a newsroom. But I think the only way you can convince people of the truth is if you have an advocate for news organizations out there talking about how good quality news organizations gather news and the standards that they uphold and the process that goes into vetting stories. And local news organizations are uniquely positioned to do something like that because the standards of media organizations vary widely. And local news organizations, as Dr. Brundidge said, seem to focus more on actually reporting the news than a lot of the bigger institutions do. So it would be nice to see a representative explaining how news decisions are made. I think that could go a long way toward rebuilding public trust, but probably a pie in the sky dream considering current finances.
Thank you. And just a quick question, Natalie, are we losing you at 7:15 or 7:30? I think you were the one who had to leave early.
No, I actually don't need to.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. My intel was wrong. Or maybe it's just outdated. Anyway.
Exactly
all right.
At one time, but yeah.
Yeah, all right. Woohoo. All right, here is, this is probably, and this last question that's been prepared by the league, we've again already started to get into because you are all really good at giving comprehensive answers that go into way more detail. But print journalism specifically, journalism in general, yes, newsrooms, struggling industry, especially local newsrooms. Print journalism, already struggling, has now, of course, had huge setbacks during COVID. I'm sure not least of which was a decrease in ad revenue. We all noticed a lot less mailers going out, a lot less ads in the paper. People just weren't spending money on them. So how can print journalism stay viable going forward, and what must it do to survive? I think there, especially us living in a rural area, there's still a huge need for it. Not everybody can get online. So I'd like to start with Mike.
Right, and that's a question I get asked a lot. I remember after becoming the editor, one of the first groups I spoke to, I got asked, will the Enterprise record still have a printed edition in 10 years? Of course, you know, I'm an optimistic guy. I said, yes, absolutely. And I think far beyond that. That was pre-COVID, of course, too. The national figures I've seen have been since March, daily newspapers have lost 40% of their advertising revenue. And this was on a graph. It was sliding downhill in the first place, and that just made it that much worse. So the flip side of that is, and you always hear, well, papers are going more digital, they need to go all digital. The truth of the matter is the bulk of our advertising is still in the print edition, between be it the print advertisements or the inserts you see, especially say in the Sunday paper or holiday papers and things like that. That's still where the bulk of our income is coming in. Another way it's changed, in my much younger days, the goal of a circulation department and a subscription was always, they hope what you paid for a subscription would basically cover the cost of getting the paper to you. Those days are gone too. Now that's a part of our revenue model now too, is that's another thing we need to stay afloat. But obviously it all comes back to, we need readers. The first 5 years I worked in this building, when I was director of our design center over in the other corner of the room, I sat right next to where our circulation department was. And every day I saw people walk down to the circulation department to maybe put a vacation hold in their paper, or, cancel or start a new one or whatever. After a couple of years, it occurred to me I had yet to see a person younger than me walk to the circulation department. And that's a problem. So, we back a year ago, when we still had arts and entertainment events going on in town, we were putting more emphasis into that. And, that was one of the many jobs Natalie's done for us already, was she did a nice job with that. But we're looking for more reasons for younger readers and more readers to want to look at the paper every day and on a weekly basis, even if not that. And that's the challenge. And that's the fun of it for me. And that's one of the many things that excites me about the job, be it, more music coverage, or just, sports, of course, is a big one for the younger people to look at. And we haven't had sports in a year either. So probably the two best avenues we've had for getting younger eyes in the newspaper, we haven't had in a year. So, it's just been kind of a perfect storm of bad things stopping us from doing what we want to do. The flip side of that being, there's so much news going on, we don't have enough bodies to cover it. So, but we go on and, we get into topics, and one thing we can do more than in years past is really gauge who is reading what story and to what degree, and what stories are getting the most hits online. That's something we're starting to keep a closer look on, and it's kind of helped us make some decisions on what we cover and how. But bottom line, you got to give people a reason to pick up the newspaper every day. It might be, Tuesday morning, you get your paper and you think, oh wait, that pro versus con feature is back in the paper today. I want to see if it's there today. Or on Thursday, oh, that's the day that dog column usually runs. I might want to look at that. And you want to have a bunch of things like that in the paper, different days, just to give them another reason to pick up and look. And for a lot of people, it's still the crossword puzzle. If we mess up the crossword, I hear about that more than anything all day long the following day, including from my 95-year-old father, who looks for that crossword every day. So you just need, the best advice I ever got about planning a daily newspaper and being the editor was, give the people exactly what they want, where they want it every day. Don't jerk them around. And every day, give them something they had no reason to believe was going to be there. Give them a surprise every day. And that's our strive. That's what we strive for. And if we do that, I remain convinced that we're going to be here for a long time. That, and of course, covering the news. A newspaper has got to have news in it. And to keep that going, we need Chico State to keep producing great journalists, because the final challenge we faced the last 3 years since the campfire is, it's really hard to hire a journalist from the outside world and say, move to Chico and good luck finding a place to live. So Chico State has been more valuable to us than ever in terms of the journalists you send us. So thank you again for that.
All right, let's go to Jennifer.
So I'll just say that I hope that print does survive, and not just because I like it or I'm nostalgic, but because research shows that it's a superior form of information delivery compared to the other forms that we have. For one, it provides a basis for and a stimulus for face-to-face political discussion, or it used to, right? People might be reading the newspaper on the subway or the bus, and talk to each other about what they were reading, right? And that face-to-face discussion is so important for making connections and providing creating a kind of social capital in a community. Other studies show that people learn a lot more from reading a newspaper in print versus watching or reading it online or watching TV, right? So when compared with watching TV, people are able to more thoughtfully remember what they read and details and nuance, right? And the arguments and so on. Their opinions are then more politically sophisticated as a result. If you compare print versus online, a study found that when people read print, they tend to read the stories, that are on the front page, right? That are suggested by the editor as important. And that might mean that somebody reads about an issue, right, that they didn't already have an interest in necessarily, right? Like people don't tend to be super interested in foreign affairs, unfortunately, right? But when they see it on the cover of the New York Times, right, they go, maybe I should read about this, right? And that has a broadening effect, an enlightening effect rather than a narrowing effect. Whereas when we read the digital version, we tend to kind of pick and choose the stories that already interest us, right? That kind of already suit our fancy, right? And then we might become hyper informed and aware along a very narrow set of concerns and issues. And so I really hope print does survive for those reasons.
Thanks. Let's go to Forrest next.
All right. Well, I don't know if people will love my answer to this question, but I think the key component to any good journalist is being honest and realistic. And I have to say, I do not see print journalism surviving in the form that we currently think of as print journalism if we are going to define that strictly as newspapers. That said, I'm very optimistic about the future of journalism. But I think we've got to look at technology in general and how it's gone. Although records have been having tremendous years in terms of media sales. Records, I think it was last year or the year before, outsold CDs for the first time in history. Records are not the dominant media. They're almost seen as a novelty. And when I lecture to a class of 80 students and I ask them how many of you read a physical newspaper or read a physical magazine, I'm now lucky if 2 hands go up. And since these are the readers of the future, I think there's got to be some acceptance that the majority of young people are getting most of their information electronically. And when you look at the data surrounding electronic media consumption, some of the media consumer who consumes the most media is actually a senior citizen or somebody approaching senior citizenhood, but they consume that media primarily on television. When you get to younger media consumers, they're consuming most of their information on their cell phones and portable devices and things like that. And I just have seen nothing in the trends to indicate that that's going to go away. That said, I'm very optimistic about journalism because in my career, when people have asked me, what do you do for a living? I don't think I ever said, well, I'm a print journalist or I'm an internet journalist. I would say, well, I'm a journalist, right? And we are no longer limited by the print form. Although Dr. Brundidge brings up a lot of good information about how it can be better for us to read in the physical media. I see so few younger people doing that I have a hard time believing we're going to suddenly see a resurgence. But the nice thing about digital media is you can have the written word, which gives you a lot more information, and you can have audio visual. You can have video examples, you can have audio examples, you can do so many things in a multimedia format that journalists of previous generations couldn't do. And I see more and more journalists exploiting that, doing really exciting things with the new technologies out there, creating types of journalism that we just never had before. And I see guys like Dan Rather, who is sort of retired, so I got my numbers right. I looked up his Facebook feed. He writes some wonderful long form articles. He has almost 3 million followers. And that's one single journalist. So I absolutely see a bright future for journalism. But if you're asking me about daily newspapers, when I've seen the contraction of the market and what I see, how young people are consuming their media, I'm a lot less optimistic about the traditional old school newspaper.
Okay, now we'll go to questions from the audience. Organize myself here. All right. And Deborah, if you have more of the stack over there, you can hand me. We're keeping distance, so there can't be so much passing notes. Yeah. All right, first question from the audience. What is the best way to deal with outright dishonesty put forward in the media? And then we had a clarification come through. This person wants to know how to deal with both people who publicly lie and media that promotes lies. So let me give this one to Jennifer first. You can punt. This isn't a forum if you need to.
That is so hard. What do we do with liars? Is that essentially is the question? Gosh. It's such a broad question. I'm not sure where to start, but and
I realized also, I think I skipped over Natalie for our last question. So Natalie, when I come to you for this question, feel free to chime in on all points. Go ahead, Jennifer, sorry.
Yeah, well, I think it's important for news organizations not to not to lie, right, themselves. And that is it's a very hard question, right? Because lying, or I'll say misinformation, or kind of more, maybe even if we don't call it misinformation, maybe even propaganda that just distorts the truth to some extent, can be very profitable for news organizations, as we see, I think, with some of the cable news stations, right? This kind of distortion of the truth gives people the lie that they want to hear, right? So when we take, for example, the lie that the election was stolen or that it was rigged, that lie was given voice on Fox News, for example, right? And so why? I don't think it's because necessarily the reporters or the believe that to be the case. It's because that's what their viewers want to hear, and that is what is profitable. And so, in many ways, we don't see that sort of thing in news organizations that are not beholden to profit, right? Like publicly owned news stations. And we don't see it as much in privately owned organizations that don't rely on that sort of thing for their profit model.
Okay, let's go to Natalie. And Natalie, feel free to chime in on the print journalism question. This is what happens when I don't have my grid for forums, and then also for the dishonesty question.
Thank you. So I think my answers actually tie in a bit because, so I'm going to answer the question about print journalism more just about newspapers in general, because I think Mike touched on something very important in that, well, one, the print the print physical edition can reach people, especially in areas like ours, much better than online. And I think what's important is to understand the community and know where some people might benefit more from the physical and the online, but be able to write. So it's multifaceted, because you have to be able to write articles hoping for an online audience, as well as understanding the print format. And that makes articles come out differently, because sometimes you're tweeting while you're there, sometimes you're getting videos and photos. Sometimes you think audio would be best, like a music story. When I wrote more for music, it was better to get audio files, and that's for online, but you still have to write a good print story that will still convey what you're talking about without having those little tools. So it's good to be able, I think reporters need to be able to diversify, as almost impossible as it can be sometimes. And the only way you'll be able to do that is to know your community, and also notice what, especially human interest and feature stories, really grab people. So Mike was talking about pulling in more stories and perspectives that people are going to keep coming back for, more different creative ways of looking at the community. And I know for myself, the most feedback and discussion I've had on articles are the ones that took people by surprise. So like a grandmother who produces art that nobody had even thought of, or like this mural, but the guy has this crazy story from out of state and nobody had any idea about it. Those are the stories people are going to be talking about for days on end, because spotlights the community and voices that they hadn't even heard from, and makes them think about something new. So I think long-winded answer in saying print and digital can serve different purposes, but you can only diversify and do that by knowing your community and being able to really reach and find those stories that will keep people coming back to you. And so also talking about issues with misinformation and lies being put forward in the media is first, most importantly, I hope as a young journalist to see less of a threat to newsrooms because of ownership, and perhaps that ownership that comes with putting forward a certain perspective. So as Ms. Brundidge was talking about, ownership, knowing that a certain perspective is profitable will be a huge detriment to the kind of output, in my opinion, if you are still following the tenets of traditional journalism. So my hope is that we can combat that kind of misinformation and putting forward lies by continuing to pursue for holding authority figures accountable and always seeking out the truth and reporting fact. My hope is that our newspapers stay alive and can stay afloat and not be beholden to the profit overhead, like that what we're all looking out for, overshadowing us, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Let's go to Forrest next.
All right. Well, I mean, I do think this is an incredibly complicated question. So we're talking about how both to cover people who openly lie and then combat the sources that spread misinformation. I think the latter is infinitely more difficult, and I don't have an excellent solution for that. I mean, I think if I did, I could probably get in some sort of think tank and be welcomed. I think combating misinformation is very difficult. I think a lot of that is going to have to do with getting in with the big tech companies, looking at the algorithms that they're using that are probably the biggest way that misinformation is spread. The Atlantic article that I mentioned earlier actually suggested regulating the algorithms, not the news stories, because the algorithms is what drags you down into the rabbit holes. But of course, anytime you talk about media regulation, that opens up a can of worms as well. But that's why it's such a difficult dilemma, right? If you regulate media, you have the government controlling your independent media. But if you don't regulate media in the environment that you're in now, you have a handful of companies controlling most of the dissemination of information, which isn't inherently better than having the government. Either way, you have very few people controlling the widespread dissemination of information. So there's probably a happy medium there with some degree of regulation over the social media companies and something like that. But we'll have to see. As far as covering people who lie, I mean, you could probably get 10 journalists together in a room and get a lot of different answers. I'm one of the people who believes that you should not amplify disinformation. In fact, you should do everything you can do not to amplify disinformation. And we saw see a lot of news media today. If a politician or somebody in power makes a false claim and it's provably false, they will simply say that the person falsely claimed. I'm a fan of that because I think you look back at earlier eras in American politics, say the McCarthy era that everybody's aware of. I think reporters played just as much a role in amplifying McCarthyism as they did in battling it and bringing it down. And I think if you look at the historical reporting accounts from that era, it is proven out. You would see people that would go out of their way to amplify McCarthy's claims. And if you study up on it, many of which were never proven, right? Were just claims that he would make. And because he was a senator, they would be openly amplified. And then you also had many great reporters working to dispel all the misinformation that was being put out there. But I think when you have those competing narratives and they're presented as competing political narratives, it's very problematic because it's really not an issue of bias, I think. I don't think you have to present the lies from one side of a political equation if they are lies. I don't think that's battling bias. I think that is amplifying misinformation.
Okay. Let's go to Mike now.
Okay, Forrest mentioned something there he's a fan of that I'm also a big fan of, which is, saying somebody stated incorrectly, or a phrase that I started seeing in stories, just 3 or so years back for the first time, were said without evidence. And it just kind of became something you saw in an awful lot of stories. And many times I thought, I don't remember seeing that before. And I wish we would have started saying that 10, 20, 30 years ago in a lot of cases. But it kind of became part of the coverage especially when, things are said that, yeah, no, that's not what happened. We need to call them out on that more. And full disclosure, a part of my job that I find the hardest is I'm a big believer in people can express their opinion in letters to the editor. I don't run a letter based on somebody's opinion, whether I agree with it or not, or the newspaper sold us or not. But then there's a matter of if they're just stating something as a fact that isn't true. And I'll send them back and I'll say, hey, you said this, but here's evidence that it's actually this. And sometimes we end up in kind of this gray area. It's like, well, this is my opinion based on how I interpreted that fact. And it gets to be a really gray area and difficult to decide sometimes. And I make the best decision I can every time. And, one day I might make a decision different than I did the other one. But that part is harder right now than I've ever seen in terms of how people say something and they'll change just a few words. It's like, well, I read this article that said this. I'm like, well, okay, that's their opinion of this based on that interpretation of it that they read. But that doesn't mean, they're coming out and saying, obviously the election was rigged or whatever. So it's, like I've said a couple times, it's a really challenging time to do these things. And I tend to err on the side of, I want people to be able to express their opinion. I'm a big believer in that. But as far as the lies, call them out when they say it. And we got to do the best we can to not spread it. Or in the case of letters to the editor, sometimes we got to make, it says right in the bottom of the page, the opinions are the opinions of the writer, whereas the opinions of an editorial or column are the opinions of the newspaper or the author. And I almost feel like we need to put that in bigger type or something sometimes lately.
Great. So we're going to keep going with audience questions. I will say that I think we should maybe stop taking questions right now in the interest of time. If you've already put your question in the chat, we're going to get to it. But it's 7:40 right now, and I know we could go until midnight. I know that. And you all would be there for it. But eventually some of us would get hungry or tired. So I'm going to say those of you who have chatted your questions in the box already, we'll get to them. And then if the rest of you could just hang back, that'd be great. So moving right along, next audience question. What about powerful people buying up newspapers and radio stations in order to influence the readership towards their perspective? What does that mean for local journalists in trying to fairly report news? Why don't we start with Natalie on this one?
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of started touching on this before, but that is one of my major concerns, especially living in a rural community where the more and more the danger is that you will have profitable figures fixing their eyes on small outlets and gaining monopolies over information, basically. And as someone in the community, it's very important to identify where those holes are, like identify more and more. There's fewer of us, we simply have less and less time on our hands, but where are those holes occurring where misinformation will then replace it? And that begins on social media, but it really also comes in when centers of profit come in and gain people's trust, maybe because they're simply mirroring back what they want to hear, and they know that that will also increase their profits. So for me, again, it's really being able to know the community and know my beats, but also do the research. So never take anything at face value, always try to follow up with multiple sources and be able to really do the research to verify facts. I think Mike brought this up earlier, that you need to check not just with the police, but with city staff and organizations that have their finger on the pulse and really do your work. I know it's much more difficult now than ever. COVID-19 has only made it more difficult as well, because you can't just go bang on someone's office door. They always tell you when you're learning in J school that you need to hang out in the lobby if you have to, and keep banging on the door if you have to. But nowadays, all we can do is keep calling them and emailing them. So it's really through those actions that I think we can combat, as much as we can, the forces of profit in our very vulnerable communities, and cross our fingers that we don't get kicked out.
Okay, let's go to Jennifer next.
I actually don't have much to say beyond what Natalie said. I thought she answered that question really well. I just think if that were to happen, and I know it is happening to some extent, it would be devastating for local news and all that it is able to offer in the way of being kind of above the fray of national partisan news media.
All right, let's go to Mike next.
Yeah, Forrest mentioned earlier, am I muted again? No, I'm not.
No, you're not.
Hey, how about that? Forrest mentioned earlier how often he hears things that people just assume about newspapers that, like, no, that never happens. And one I've heard more than almost anything is, oh, you're covering it that way because of your ownership. You know, they're telling you to report it that way with that slant. And I remember the 23 years I worked at newspapers in the Bay Area, I saw publishers in the newsroom 4 times. 3 were to announce that the newspaper had been sold, and the 4th was because we'd won a Pulitzer. And it just doesn't happen anywhere near to the degree that people think they do. It might, in terms of an endorsement, or in our case, the biggest one we've had here was AB5. You know, as a newspaper company in California, we took a big stand against AB5 because we knew financially it was just going to be, you know, a really big nail in what we were hoping wasn't going to be a coffin for us. So we fought that hard as a group. But otherwise, the corporate ownerships, and we're owned by one that buys up a lot of newspapers. You know, we're owned ultimately by Alden Capital, and they're a lot more, you know, they spend a lot more time talking to the advertising director about the revenue. You know, I don't know if they know who I am or who a lot of the editors are some days, frankly, at least not to that degree. So where it does hurt us is constant consolidation. You know, they have expectations of a profit. So we keep getting smaller, and that's where it really makes it harder for us to do our jobs. It's not so much corporate from above telling us what to do. It's the fact that we got a budget to make, so we often end up doing it with less people. I can't speak for the radio world. It could be a different deal there, but for newspapers, that's really where we get hit with that way more.
Okay, Forrest.
Sure. Well, I have a few things to say about this. First, and this may give people some comfort, I will echo exactly what Mike said. I spent more than a decade working for what at the time was the biggest newspaper company in the nation, Gannett. And there were zero instances where I was ever pressured to take an editorial stance based on what corporate wanted. There were, of course, meetings. We would decide the type of things we were going to cover more due to focus groups and things along that lines. Like, hey, your audience seems to be particularly interested in this type of story. I think that's what any media organization would do. But never was I asked to slant a story in one direction or another. That said, Kathy, I'm not sure if you're concerned as much about corporate ownership as you are very powerful individuals, because we certainly have seen powerful individuals taking ownership of media, well, really since America began. You can go all the way back to the colonial papers, and you would have newspapers that were designed to push a particular political slant. And I don't see any way to change that, but I do think you have reason to be concerned. William Randolph Hearst kind of famously got into the newspaper industry because his father acquired the San Francisco Examiner, and by all accounts, his father had no real interest in journalism. He saw it as a political tool. Okay, and then William Randolph Hearst had political interests as well, and would certainly use his very powerful media chain to push political objectives. So this is something that has been happening, and there is some concern, and there's certainly stories about the Hearst era with Hearst figures, influencing what was printed in the papers. One of the most recent accounts I can think of with this is Sheldon Adelson, when he took control of the Las Vegas Review-Journal. He passed away recently, so it's not a concern, but there were local journalists in Las Vegas who went on record claiming that some of their stories were altered or censored in some way based on the wishes of Sheldon Adelson. That would be concerning to any journalist. I don't know any journalist would want that to happen, that would not see that as terrifying. So I think you do have a reason to be worried. That said, I think if you look back at the history of media ownership, I'm not sure there's anything that can be done about it. The other big example would be Jeff Bezos in the Washington Post. I have not seen an awful lot of stories indicating that Jeff Bezos is influencing day-to-day storytelling in the Washington Post, and I see a lot of great journalism coming out of the Washington Post. But I will say too, I may be reading the wrong things, or if there is something like that going on, maybe Bezos is a lot better with his PR campaigns than Sheldon Adelson was. So I see reasons for concern. I see a long history of this happening. And I'm just not sure what the answer would be, other than local journalists doing their best, like Natalie was talking about, to do good, high quality reporting and to try to maintain their independence at every turn.
Okay, thank you. Next question. This questioner wanted to go back to the topic of the role and responsibility of the media to be the eyes and ears of the public in observing government bodies and agencies. What problems might you have seen with the diminished public's access to or heard voice in those public agency decisions and actions, especially during the pandemic? And we'll go ahead and start with Mike.
Yeah, it's as far as public access, Natalie mentioned this a while ago. It's when we can't be in a room and we're relying on a phone call. It's a lot easier to avoid a phone call or an email than it is to have somebody there knocking on your door or wanting to talk to you in person. That's in certain corners. I think we've probably had a harder time the past year getting reaction from people, and it's reaction that we should get in the sake of fairness. It's like, somebody might say, well, this happened and I don't like the way they did that. And then you want to go over here and get that reaction. And, there have been times we've tried, I don't know, a week or 10 days because we held on to a story because in the interest of fairness, we wanted to get the other reaction, and the other person would just keep avoiding us. So we write the story and then, well, gee, that's not fair. You didn't get my side of it. And that's a struggle for us probably more than ever right now. But yeah, the pandemic, I think in particular, has made that more difficult. And just, we had an episode a week or two ago earlier this month, and I see there's a Brown Act question coming up. The Chico City Council replaced their city attorney in a closed session at night, and they come out and they're required by the Brown Act to come out and announce what they did, but they came out and announced it to an empty chamber because the public was not allowed to be there. And we're thinking, well, this, the Brown Act didn't really see the coronavirus coming, or they didn't really know that meetings were going to be on, on an audio feed and not people there. So yeah, it just never gets any easier. But, I think Natalie answered that one before the question even came up, where it's just a lot easier to get people to talk to you if you're knocking on their door instead of looking at their cell phone to see what phone number is trying to call them again.
Natalie, to you.
Yeah, Mike mentioned one of those issues. I've had multiple things happen this past year with the technology bump everyone's struggling with or say they're struggling with. Like, for example, watching committees and commission meetings is much more difficult if you can't go to the building, you can't be assured everyone will be in the room. Instead, you have to hope that the Zoom link will be up, or the webinar will be up, or you can even access it, or they often do not even record it. There have been times when I had to retrieve a USB of a meeting and I only had 15 minutes of the meeting on the USB file, and I asked them, where's the rest of the meeting? And they said, technical difficulties, and they can get away with that. And that's simply the reality we're facing this year. It's really shaken up journalism, I think, because there are certain things that we thought we had because of the Brown Act, and we technically still have, but there are so many, I don't want to say gray areas, but very fuzzy little boxes we get into now where we simply could not have accounted for these issues. And unfortunately, we can't necessarily prove it was planned or coordinated or anything like that. It just makes it much more difficult for us to do our job. And the main thing is that the public will not be informed the way they could have been, which is the ultimate goal in democracy, of course. So I will say that has been happening much more than I would like. There have been other instances that have happened that actually happened in person that I won't get into, where we were blocked from, and I just feel like that tends to happen more in the environment we're in, that there's just more mistrust of the media, there's more automatic assumption of bias, and I don't know if you can necessarily trace that to just the last 4 years, although it's been worsened, definitely, but more and more of a belief that the media don't necessarily have a right to be there, or here's all these loopholes we can use to make the media be as far away as possible so they can't get that shot or they can't hear that conversation. And unfortunately, the pandemic has worsened that in so many ways. And that's not just a local thing, it's a state thing, it's federal, it's everywhere. And we just have to be very diligent as a result.
Great, let's go to Forrest.
I really don't have an awful lot to add on this because I think Mike and Natalie did such a good job, and they're the ones that, have the boots on the ground really in this. As a journalism professor, I spend most of my time teaching these days. So I have done some journalism in the last year, but not the type that they were talking about. So, I mean, I think they gave you a pretty good answer to the question. So I'll just, I'll be quiet now.
All right, to Jennifer then.
Yes, I think they answered the question really well. I actually had no idea that access was an increasing problem lately. So this is news to me. And yeah, it's, gosh, I hope that changes. I think the pandemic and Chico in general feels more polarized than ever. And I think that is probably reflected in a more hostile attitude toward journalists. And for that, I'm sorry, and I hope things change. I don't have much to add.
Okay, so this next question is about social media. The question is, what is the future of social media? Will it continue to distort news, and will people continue to gravitate towards sources that reinforce their biases, and how does this turn out? And so then, Jennifer, I'm going to give this to you first, since you've already touched on this and talked about bias reinforcement.
Yeah, well, gosh, what is the future of social media? Well, if you, what is that documentary on Netflix? What is it called?
Social Dilemma.
Thank you. If you watch that, it doesn't look good, right?
It's a very depressing
It's
documentary.
a very
but it's very
depressing
illuminating.
documentary for sure. Let me first talk about, we're very down on social media, and I want to talk about some of the gifts of social media for a second, and then we'll wind back and say, what is the future? I mean, early on, right, I think I was quite excited about social media when it first came on, right? Because it provides a basis for us to, connect with one another, to potentially discuss politics, to share news articles, for marginalized groups and voices to be heard, and to associate with one another and find one another. So there are a lot of gifts of social media. But I think slowly over time, and certainly, if you're a Democrat or left-leaning in any way, I think everybody was pretty excited about social media, when Obama was president, because it seemed to be working out quite well for him, and might have been responsible for, propelling him to the White House in large part. But right, over time, we've seen kind of the ways in which, the dark side of social media, right, which is the spread of misinformation and the reinforcement of perspectives and, algorithms, right, that target us with misinformation that we're likely to be receptive to. And Russian disinformation and, all of these horrible things. And we've seen social media giants who, I don't want to say they've been unresponsive, but maybe haven't been sufficiently responsive to these concerns. I think we can certainly say that. So I don't know if it's realistic or not, but if we want to have a good future with social media, we have to not take as natural the current algorithmic course that social media is on, right? Algorithms are not neutral. They're not predestined, right? They can be written in different ways. And so I think sometimes we see technology and we think, how could it be any other way? This is the way it is, right? This is what we're stuck with. And it is what we're stuck with to the extent that it seems to be quite profitable for these social media giants to operate in this way. So, of course, I think the answer is regulation. I think, like, television media, right, where we, which is which used to be, I guess, more regulated, has been slowly deregulated as well. But where we used to think, a modicum of regulation was needed with, say, the fairness doctrine and so on. I think we can see the need for some regulation on social media, such that its algorithms are not, pathological toward democracy. And that democracy essentially gets a say, right? And the public and the public good is taken into account, right? However, we want to define that as a public, and so, the answer that I hear back a lot is, how could we possibly regulate? It's so complicated. These people are such geniuses and they understand this technology, and, so yeah, I get it. It also strikes me that we could put some geniuses, out to work, right, on these problems, that could help us to come up with effective regulations. Another possibility is a publicly funded social media option, right, where that could be the exclusive focus, the public good and democratic concerns. So these are my suggestions.
Okay, let's go to Natalie next, because I know, Natalie, you've already touched upon using social media in your reporting and the marriage of print, social media, etc. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I believe that social media will continue to dominate how people consume their media or their news and all information, for good or for worse, usually for worse. I think so. Something I was thinking about when we were talking about this is recently we saw something happen that I think only marginally affected Facebook, but it definitely reflected what was going on. I don't if people know about the app Parlay or Parlor, depending on how you pronounce it. I noticed that there was a large movement on Facebook right after the election to move to this app, and it was just another reflection of when the perception is starting to be that this particular social media or company is not reflecting the views that you would like to discuss, or you would like another way to discuss it. This is another place you can go, a base to have discussion that you feel is more reflective of your community. And I think those things tend to happen only in spurts, and it's for over and over again, they seem to come back to the same basis. So somehow Facebook and Twitter have continued to be those mainstays. Twitter, I think, is interesting too, because I think people forget that about 10 years ago, Twitter was actually struggling. 8 to 10 years ago was really struggling to continue to hold on. And I think journalists in part saved Twitter, which is not the best thing as I'm saying it. Journalists need to be media literate. Journalists need to have the impossible job of understanding social media evolving all the time, every month. Especially it's evolved even just in the last year so much during the pandemic, because people are on their phones even more than ever. I think that journalists have a need to understand social media, because it really does inform how people are looking at their world, and understand that people are not divorcing from social media. It's just going to evolve, but it really has taken over how people are seeing information disseminated. But you do have a way to reach them, and it's very important to understand how you're reaching them and understand how can I better engage with the community. So there are some ways you can use it for good. I have been able to use Facebook for some good, such as reaching out to bear fire survivors, being able to get into these groups where sometimes these groups are the only way people can communicate with each other, especially when they've been displaced and scattered everywhere, and they are just hurting for basic needs and supplies. And sometimes that is the best way to be able to reach people where they're at and say, do you need anything? I'm looking for someone who's experiencing this condition. Do you mind sharing your story with me? Sometimes that has been the way you can talk to people and gain their trust. So as Ms. Brundidge mentioned, there are ways we can use this for the public good and understand how it is a very much a positive in the community at times, but also never forget that it really is our enemy in terms of getting the real information out to people, if that makes sense.
All right, let's go to Mike next.
Yes, I almost feel like I write about this almost every week in my column. I know it has been every week, but I know it's been a lot, just on the need of people to be able to have civil discussions with people they disagree with, and how that's just, it's not gone, but it's on life support. It feels like it really does. And I blame social media for so much of that. But again, I also see that as an opportunity. I dream of a social media platform that, I hate to use the word regulates here, but just monitors that and encourages debate, and maybe finds out people aren't as far apart as they think they always are based on the way that they're talking to each other. I'd love to see that happen. I'm not real optimistic that it will soon. But yeah, in the meantime, I see people more and more, they're just going to where they know everybody will agree with them based on what they said, and further misperceptions or untruths will kind of get spread that way. And what we can do is just try to be seen as the more consistent, reasonable source for things in the midst of all that. And Natalie wrote a really good story a few months back on people leaving one social media platform for another, and the reaction I got to that story just absolutely proved the point behind the story, which was people can't stand not being around people who don't agree with them. They only want to hear their point of view to a certain thing. And it was just an interesting mix of both praise and criticism from every corner. Usually maybe one side will like a story and the other side will be mad, or vice versa. I got good and bad from every side on that story, which had me thinking, hey, there's a good sign we really hit the mark with that one. I thought it was the most perfectly balanced story we've had. And but yeah, the last advice David Little gave me his last day here before I took over as editor was never look at social media, especially the enterprise record site. Never look at the comments, never look at what people are saying about us. And I have failed miserably in that. There are days where I dive into it and it's hard to get out, and then I'll go a few days and not look. If I thought it was more productive, I'd spend more time doing it, because I have had a lot of really productive talks with certain people that I meet through that forum. Even before I became editor, I met people that way and discussed the job. It's there's just too many people that they don't want to hear that they're maybe not right about what they're saying, or they might say everything in this story is against us. They don't want to sit down with you and have a conversation and say, well, show me where, show me what parts you thought weren't fair. Okay, well, did you see this part here that actually addresses that? And I just wish more people were willing to have that talk. And I think social media is the reason they don't.
Okay, Forrest, to you.
All right. Well, you got a lot of good answers, great answers, really, so far. I'll try to go through them point by point. So, looking at Frederica's question, what's the future of social media? I try not to make really broad predictions, because, you know, people have been asking me for 20 years, well, what's the future of journalism? And I say, well, you know, if I knew that, I would design this news organization that would be the most dominant news organization the world has ever seen, and that would be my future. And so I don't know exactly what the future is, but I do have predictions that can be taken as just such. Will it continue to distort the news? Sadly, with all the trends I'm seeing, my answer would probably be yes, because I don't see a lot of willingness on the part of the people running social media companies to change that. And as we've talked about, there is actually even a profit motive in some instances to continue, not to spread disinformation, but the way the algorithms work, the way they make their profit, dividing people, sending them down rabbit holes, keeping them on social media is profitable to these companies. You know, just giving good, straightforward news isn't as profitable very often as things like conspiracy theories that keep people digging in and digging deeper and things along that lines. Will people continue to gravitate towards sources that reinforce their biases? I would say all psychological research that I've seen indicates yes. Right? People are driven toward confirmation bias. There's psychological theories out there that talk about how once you build up a certain image or a stereotype in your mind, it's very difficult to change your thinking on that subject. You can, it can be done, is the good news, but it's difficult. There was a really good Knight Foundation Gallup sort of research project back in 2017 where they actually determined that the most biased readers are the ones who perceive bias the most loudly. Cutting it down,
Really?
it was basically showing that people want bias, right? If you took the labels off of news stories and didn't tell them it was presented by the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, they were less likely to perceive bias than if you labeled it from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because they were looking for the bias. And so will that change? Boy, it sure doesn't seem to me like it will. So that leaves journalists just to do all the things that Mike and Natalie and all of us have been talking about. Just do the best job that we can. Do the job as well as you can. I think the way that we combat all this really is media literacy, which frighteningly I see as probably the biggest problem. And nobody likes to hear that the problem is you, right? Everybody likes to point the finger at the media, which when people tell me all the evil things the media is doing, I'm like, well, let's start by defining the media. Right? Are we talking about the record industry? Are we talking about the movie industry? Are we talking about newspapers? Are we talking about cable news? Because these things are so vast and have such different standards. And we can educate ourselves to delve into the better sources. Like, we can solve the problem, but there seems to not be a lot of widespread interest in that. There's a good book I use for one of my classes, The Anatomy of Fake News, where the author, Nolan Higdon, says that the average American has a tough time deciding between good, accurate news and disinformation, which is frightening to hear. But, you know, he advances that narrative and sells it pretty well, which to me means the real solution to all this is making ourselves more media literate, you know, figuring out ways to sniff out the bad sources from the good, and, you know, finding the sources that have been honest with you for a long time, like the Chico Enterprise record, right? Finding the sources that have been right most of the time, and when they have been wrong, admit to being wrong. And so I think that's the key.
Great. So I'd like to get to the last two questions, but we are over time. So what I'm going to do is I think these questions are a little directed. So I'm going to divide them up and ask the panelists to be very brief in answering the questions. So first question, I'm going to direct toward our two education panelists. Our two panelists are currently working in education, I should say. Wide background. But the question is, how would you train students to recognize lies? This has already been touched on, especially in the last part of Forrest's answer, but Jennifer, I'm going to go to you. Very brief answer, elevator pitch.
Well, I'm actually teaching a class called Propaganda and Public Opinion right now. So it's sort of part of what I do, right? Just kind of recognizing the structure and characteristics of propaganda can be helpful, right? To differentiate it from mere persuasion, right? Because persuasion remains important in democracy, but how do we differentiate it? And I'm going to leave it brief and not tell you what the difference is.
Okay.
But just recognizing that as a construct can be useful. But I think Forrest, you already kind of touched upon this, right? Finding sources that you trust to tell you the truth most of the time, and if you are reading a source that is telling you something that no other source is confirming or backing or suggesting is accurate, no credible source is, then it could very well be a lie, right? So, you know, sometimes people find themselves down information rabbit holes, finding like the one piece of news that confirms what they would like to believe. But maybe that one piece of news, if it's the only piece of news, is possibly wrong. Yeah.
Great. Forrest, anything to add on what you said in your previous answer? Quick elevator pitch about educating students.
You know, that's a great answer. I usually, with students, I try to put it really simply to get them to take it to heart. Very often I'll say something like, hey, think about your friend group, right? If you have a friend that you've known for 10 years and they never lead you astray, they always have your back. If that person comes to you and gives you a piece of information, you trust them, right? And then think about, you know, somebody maybe you haven't known as long and half the things they've said to you have turned out to be untrue. Well, you're not going to trust that, right? Look at your news sources in much the same way. Do some research. Look at the ones that have been around a while, that have had very few scandals. And if they have had scandals, they've come clean about it. And that's sort of the way I teach it. You know, of course, we go into longer form, but it seems to work, at least to some degree.
Great. Very last thing for Mike and Natalie, the Brown Act question. Are you watching reporting on local governmental bodies for good practices in terms of the Brown Act and open meetings law? Very brief answers. Natalie, we'll start with you.
Yes, in fact, you may have seen an article recently in which we actually had to go to California Newspapers Association attorney in regards to that issue Mike mentioned, in regards to whether or not the Brown Act could have been violated with a closed session meeting, which was held out, like there was no record made of it and none of it was videotaped and no announcement was made possible to the public. So we are trying to be diligent in covering how the Brown Act is perhaps being pended by not just COVID-19, but also questionable meetings and access of that nature.
Great. Mike, last word.
Absolutely. And I suspect it'll continue as things kind of evolve in that world for a lot of different reasons I won't get into right now. But I see more of that coming and us reporting on it. And as we have other things, I mean, a year and a half ago, we had a story on several local politicians were blocking people from their government Facebook page, which is illegal. And, you know, so we're always looking out for those because, you know, we believe in the First Amendment and free speech, of course.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists, Forrest, Jennifer, Mike, and Natalie, for their time, and also thank all of our attendees. At one point in total, there were 55 of us in total at one point when I looked. So this was an incredibly popular topic. There have already been suggestions that we do some sort of follow-up, incorporating even more media, people who work in media around town. That'd be great. We as the League would love that. So obviously there's interest. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.